Americans for Prosperity North Dakota proudly supported important policy improvements that broke barriers for all North Dakotans this legislative session. From tackling unnecessary and burdensome occupational licensing standards to fighting for tax relief, AFP is proud to have played a part in improving the lives of North Dakotans this year. Join AFP today by visiting www.afpnd.org. This advertisement was paid for by Americans for Prosperity. Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I am your host, Rob Port. Later in the show, a conversation with North Dakota University System Chancellor Mark Hagerott talking about, essentially kind of the future of financing higher education in North Dakota. It was a good conversation. Stay tuned for that. But before we get there, let's talk about massage therapists and sex workers. And an issue that popped up in my hometown of the city of Minot. The Minot Daily News recently reported about sex workers who operate under the guise of lawful business. And you could probably guess what kind of business I'm talking about. Massage businesses. Essentially, massage, and you can read the article for yourself. It's by Jill Schramm. It was in the Minot Daily News. It was picked up and syndicated by the Forum News Service. But essentially what's happening is that there was an arrest recently in Minot of a woman who was operating as a massage therapist, but in truth was a sex worker. This has prompted some frustration from people who operate as actual massage therapists, not sex workers, and they're frustrated because their profession is used a lot as cover for sex work. And they're frustrated because they want to see maybe more enforcement on licensing and et cetera, et cetera. And my take, and I wrote about this at sayanythingblog.com, granted, I'm kind of going off in a libertarian direction, and this is a pipe dream because politically this isn't going to happen anytime soon. But I like to plant the seed. I like to talk about it because I think it's worth talking about it. And I think a lot of people maybe who would support the idea are afraid to talk about it. But what if instead of toughening licensing requirements and having stricter enforcement for massage therapists, what if we licensed sex workers? Which is to say, what if we made sex work legal? Now, I'm not talking about human trafficking sex work where somebody is a slave and, kidnapped somewhere or otherwise coerced into sex work by, organized criminals. I'm not talking about that sort of thing. I am certainly not talking about, underage sex work, where people who are not adults are, again, exploited. What I am talking about is a consensual transaction for sex between adults. I don't understand why this sort of thing should be illegal. And in some ways happens informally all the time right in front of us. I mean, there's the cliche about the, 25-year-old who marries an, 80-year-old billionaire. I think a lot of people, probably rightfully so, have a hard time believing that sort of a connection, that sort of a relationship is about love. There's actual websites out there that hook up women who are looking for quote-unquote sugar daddies, men who will spend money on them, take them shopping, give them money, and in exchange, the woman gives them a relationship, which I'm assuming probably usually includes sex. We, if not condone those things, we certainly allow them. They're legal. They happen all the time. In fact, pornography is legal. I mean, somehow if you pay people to have sex and film it, that's legal. But if you have two people who pay, one person pays another one to have sex with them, that is illegal. So some of the lines we've drawn on this don't make a lot of sense to me. Now, human trafficking is a real problem. Prostitution has something that has gone on almost since the earliest days of humanity, right? There's that old Rudyard Kipling coined it in I think it was an article he wrote, back around the turn of the last century. But essentially, sex work is called the world's oldest profession for a reason, because it's always been with us. It's never gone away. It's not going to go away. It doesn't really matter what degree we make it illegal, to what degree we outlaw it. It just doesn't matter. It exists. It happens. And if it's going to happen anyway, maybe we could lower the amount of abuse involved. Maybe we could increase, better protect public health from STDs and other things that are incumbent upon that kind of work if we just brought it out into the sunlight and licensed it and regulated it and taxed it and just had it be a service that you could purchase. Maybe not a service that everybody necessarily agrees with. I'm not saying that, we should it's just suddenly going to be okay in our society to visit a sex worker. If you don't condone the idea, you should continue to not condone it. Your morals are yours. I'm just saying it's going to happen anyway, and there are people out there who view this as just fine. Why not let it happen? Why not let entrepreneurs open brothels? Require them to obtain licenses from which they must submit to inspections aimed at ensuring health and safety. And the thing is, if willing seller, willing buyer transactions for sex works are legal, perhaps we could put a big dent in demand for sexual services provided by men and women who are being exploited. Now, I'm not talking about this as though it were some sort of a panacea that's going to solve all our problems, right? I'm saying this in the context of national headlines about Jeffrey Epstein, the I think he's a billionaire, the very, very rich man, very wealthy man with all sorts of powerful political and social connections, including to royalty in Europe, to political figures like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump here in the United States. This is a person who exploited children, and legalizing prostitution is probably not going to make pedophiles like him, be any less interested in being pedophiles. Those sorts of things are still going to exist. But we could take some part of this market, right? We could take some of this sex work and drag it out into the light and make it something that's just available, that's regulated, that again is happening in the daylight. Because think about it this way. Sex workers, a lot of times, if they get abused, say they get raped by a client or hurt by a client or something, a lot of times they're afraid to go to the police because, in reporting something like that, you have to admit that you were engaged in an activity that is illegal. Now, generally speaking, I think law enforcement has done a better job of maybe taking a more pragmatic view towards sex work, but that point of view is not necessarily universal. And the fact remains, it is illegal under our current laws. And I'm not a proponent of just ignoring laws for the sake of pragmatism. If it is the law, it ought to be enforced. If we don't want the law to be enforced, then it ought not be a law anymore. Or it ought to be a different law. Now, I think a lot of people are probably listening to this and thinking I'm crazy, thinking I'm espousing some sort of a libertarian pipe dream. And maybe I am. The political will to do this sort of thing is not out there. I mean, we barely have the political will to legalize marijuana in this country. I mean, we're still grappling with that, and I think that's a much less provocative step, I should say, than legalizing prostitution. But I look at the demand that's serviced by human trafficking. I look at demand for sex work that is serviced by people who are exploited or people who exploit other people to fulfill that demand. And I'm thinking to myself, what if we could fulfill at least some of that demand with people who are willing to serve it and who are protected by the law in transactions that are regulated by the law, so that they're healthier? That seems like a better way to go to me. It seems like it's not going to solve the problem of exploitive sex work. It's not going to solve the problem of abuse, but it might make it better. It might make it significantly better. Because again, it's going to happen. As long as there are people willing to pay for sex, there are going to be other people who are willing to sell it to them or sell them, maybe I'm talking about the slavery and the human trafficking. I mean, it's going to be out there. But if there's demand for sex, people want to pay for it, why not make it legal for people who who are adults and willingly and making the choice of their own volition, want to provide that service in exchange for compensation negotiated between the two parties? What's so wrong about that if it's going to happen anyway? Now, this is usually the point at the argument where people say, well, murder's illegal and people still murder. Theft is illegal and people still steal. Those are not arguments for making theft legal or making murder legal. But again, what I'm talking about here is not murder. It's not theft. It's not rape. It's not any of those things. Those things are all crimes. Those things are all things perpetrated on an unwilling party. What I am talking about is consensual transactions between two adults. Why shouldn't those be legal? I think they should. Chancellor Mark Hagerott coming up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. North Dakota University System Chancellor Mark Hagerott joins me now. Mark, how are you?
I'm wonderful after the 4th of July weekend, and thank you for having me on your show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming on, and I hope you had a good holiday. I wanted to have you on. There was an interesting article by my colleague, Sydney Mook, talking about the University of Alaska's university system, and so that they're having a fight over, and I don't want to get too far deep into Alaskan politics, but I mean they're looking at potentially a 41% cut in state funding. A lot of that has to do with conditions that are peculiar to Alaska. I think it's before their governor, Mike Dunleavy. There's a question he may veto it. They're not sure if they have the votes to veto it. It's a situation that's unfolding up there. But what was interesting is Sydney wrote an article essentially talking about that situation and putting it in the context of North Dakota and quoted you pretty extensively. Because North Dakota, our economy is pretty similar to Alaska in that we are very dependent on commodities. Now, Alaska is very dependent on pretty much one commodity, plus they have like a tourism industry. They're mostly energy. North Dakota's agriculture and energy, so we're even a little bit more diversified than Alaska is, but not a whole lot more. We ride the commodities roller coaster here as well, and it's not very fun. And in fact, just a couple budget cycles ago, or maybe just one budget cycle ago, we had some pretty tough sledding with our budget, and we saw a lot of cuts in higher education. And your take on this was that we need to continue to invest in higher education. What do you mean by that? Could you tell us, I mean, just what message do you want North Dakotans to understand as we watch what is happening in Alaska and as we, obviously remember what North Dakota just came through?
Well, great question. And thank you again for taking time on substantive issues, because this is a hugely important issue. And my heart goes out. I know many Alaskans, and we're on different, Western groups together, and I know they're navigating in difficult times. I want to be sure that if there's any Alaskan, people who are listening to your podcast, which I wouldn't be surprised, I know you have a national following, that I understand they're in a difficult circumstance. And you're right. We've had something similar because we are an energy commodity state. And I just want to thank our leaders, the legislature, the governor, the state board, and even the voters, that they've been very thoughtful about trying to avoid kind of a situation Alaska has it in. And what I mean there is, I think the Alaska thing is they're having kind of a conflict or tension between, current consumption of, paying out a fee right now versus long-term investment in what I would say our children's future. And so we're in a better situation, but we're really talking about, how does our state diversify its economy? How do we accelerate innovation? How do we address workforce issues? And the higher ed system is an incredible tool to do that. But we have to fund it, to be able to compete and adapt. So I think that's the crux of the issue we're talking about here.
So how do we do that? How do we adapt? How does the university system and frankly our state government adapt for that reality so that we don't have wild fluctuations in funding as we ride that commodity roller coaster?
Yeah, well, another great question. And, it's so exciting, to be, here at this time in history to try to help our state transition. The governor says this, any North Dakotan who's traveled to some of the big cities and some of the other states should come home very positive because we have incredible range of options ahead because of this, incredible Western energy economy. And so I think two things that we have to do is, one, we have to seriously think about how to help North Dakota. And that means our faculty, our administrators and whatnot need to think about what does North Dakota need for the future. And we need to, get out of the ivory tower and really look at what does our state need. And I want to commend, our legislature that they had some very progressive legislation like 1171. I've got actually the new policy that they've told us to develop here in higher ed. That is for workforce development. They're giving scholarships and loan repayment for high demand workforce. Okay. So resources focused through the higher ed system to help employers and employees so that North Dakotans can see the value. The other thing is we have to look at medium to long-term trends. We have to fly the plane right now. The kids keep turning 18 and coming to school, but then adult learners are coming back in droves. So we have to be able to meet them, in August and meet that. But also we have to look at longer term trends, and that's where the state board, led by Nick Hacker and now Casey Ryan, has a long-term strategy. And we just had an exercise just a week ago called Envision 2030, the follow-up of where do we see the trends leading us. So we're helping employers, employees, partnering with them to get ready for the new jobs. So kind of those are two elements of doing this. Getting ready for the future instead of waiting for a crisis, in a legislative session and, what Alaska has now.
You said get out of the ivory tower. What does that mean?
Well, there's an old saying, and it goes back to, really early in education, where you had professors that were deeply thinking about philosophy. And they were literally in towers, and then you had the townspeople trying to just make it, just trying to make it. And there's some classic cases where literally, professors were burned for their studies in religion and whatnot. And so there was this idea that the professors and the institutions became detached from reality. And for much of our history, that could be the case. Schools were typically divinity schools, They were, before the Land Grant Act, were kind of just, that detachment. With the Land Grant Act, it became, hey, you got to develop agriculture courses and mechanical arts courses to help with industrialization. Well, now we're into the next epic thing, which is the digitization, and in North Dakota, this high precision, fracking and oil industry that takes highly skilled people. And our professors are doing actually a wonderful job in many, many institutions of what do we need for our economy and our people, and developing programs that are highly relevant to workforce and employers. And we're doing that. I don't know that much about Alaska. Did they perhaps lag on that? So there was less support publicly, but we see that as one of our key responsibilities of responding to workforce and business demands. And remind me to come back to liberal arts, because I do want to say some important things about that too. But that's what I mean by getting out of the ivory tower and meeting people where they are. Yeah.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, give people, I think sometimes, and I was up at Minot State about a year or so ago. We were having a discussion, and it was kind of a liberal arts discussion. I mean, it was, I think the premise was, should we throw Shakespeare out of the ivory tower? And it was sort of, the focus on STEM studies versus liberal arts and literature and everything. And my argument was, well, we can do both, but you can't go around and on one hand sell students on going into debt and paying tuition and fees and putting in the time and everything to obtain a degree on the idea that they're going to then use that degree to earn more money over a lifetime. You can't do that without delivering an education that's useful in the marketplace. For most people, if you're gonna go tens of thousands of dollars into debt to get a higher education degree, you need that degree to be valuable to you. You need that degree to bolster your earning power. And I know that sometimes some people in academia, think that's, sort of Philistines feel that way. But for most of us, like, we don't have a lot. I mean, my daughter's going to Bismarck State College in the fall. And I have saved money up for her, but I'll tell you, we can't afford for her. I can't afford to subsidize a lengthy matriculation through a college to get some degree that ultimately is not going to land her a job. I need her. That's the whole point of this exercise. So I understand what you're saying there. Let's talk specifically about North Dakota's budget. Because again, like you, I don't necessarily know all the backstory to what's happening in Alaska, but I look at our budget and I look at the trend line for funding higher education. And there's always a lot of talk about the funding that came down, right? We came down from sort of boom level eras of funding. The bottom dropped out of oil prices. The bottom dropped out of commodity prices. We were cutting across the board in state budgets, and higher ed the North Dakota University system took a big cut. They took a haircut. There's no doubt about it. But if you roll back the clock a little bit, there was also a big buildup too, where we were increasing funding in higher education by double-digit percentages. I mean, sometimes, some years, some cycles, we were talking like 20, 30% budget increases in higher ed. And so part of me wonders if we're doing that the right way. Because I always worry when we're putting things in the budget structurally like that, is it sustainable, right? Like if you build a new building as the state of North Dakota, you got to maintain that building. You can't just go away. So I worry that we bloated spending on higher ed and then we had to cut a whole bunch of it. And really what we ought to be doing is going to a model where the costs of higher ed and is paid for by the people attending the universities for the most part. Now I know you're probably going to come back at me and say, well, only 25% or whatever the number is actually comes from the general fund. And I suppose you're right if we don't count, all the money the taxpayers spend subsidizing, tuition and things like that through the Bank of North Dakota or different programs, federal programs and what have you. But I worry about the buildup. Higher education is intended to serve a customer base, right? I mean, those are the students, whether they're traditional young students coming out of high school or, maybe older students who are coming back to get educated to try out a different career. Those are who you're serving. And can't we tie the costs as closely as possible to those people? How do we avoid, are there, and maybe I'm having a hard time getting to a question here, but are the structural, do we do too much to build up structural spending in higher education? Maybe that's the right question. Do you understand what I'm getting? Mark, make sense of what I'm asking you, please.
No, you're grappling with what many states are grappling with. You are hitting the big issue. I mean, look at our national leaders. They are all over the map, right? I mean, here's Democrats saying free college for everybody. And then our president, gave a huge tax cut to, basically, not education. Okay, we'll just say it that way, nice way, And so yet we are a state that has the number one propensity of high school kids, and parents like you, congratulations, by the way, of encouraging your daughter to go. But North Dakota is number one out of 50 states that parents and the kids want to go to college. So there are some states where it's not that important. And I won't pick names, but there are states that are at half our rate. So in a state like that, where their culture is about current consumption, I want to buy, the new boat and I want to buy the new truck or whatever, that their culture might be, hey, disinvest in education. But I think our legislature and our governor, who are both, big on education, are right to err on the side of investing more, not less. However, back to your second point of who should pay, you can see in this terrible scandal in some of our quote-unquote elite universities where these very wealthy parents were paying for backdoor admissions, that if wealthy people are falling over themselves to get their kids into school, do we really want working families who are struggling to say, well, we're really not going to help you as much anymore. You got to find a way to get to school. So that's why, I think our state should look at our people, our human capital, as an incredible resource, and we should err on the side of trying to help them more rather than less. And let me explain to you one reason why. Stanford and Harvard, their foundations now are bursting with money, okay? They think the day may be coming where you get into Stanford or Harvard, you don't have to pay any tuition because they have so much money, okay? Yeah. So our state, we're not quite there. But one could argue that we would want to even better help our students with good programs and scholarships so the parents don't have to indebt themselves or their kids to get the education that the elite families do. So, you're onto something there, but I think given our culture that goes way back to the Norwegians, Swedes, and Germans, that we value education, and the data shows that. So
well, we do.
So let's.
There have been times where North Dakota has led the nation in per capita spending on higher education. That was
correct
in the not too distant past. Maybe we're not quite there, but we got to be even now. I would imagine. I haven't looked at the list recently, but I would imagine we're still near the top. So you're right. And I think North Dakotans, I think Minnesotans, I think people from this part of the country, we do value education. I think it shows up in our K through 12 system. I think it shows up in the number of kids that go to college. I think it shows up in the fact that we have 11 public campuses in a state with, less than 800,000 people living in it. We have an outsized university system. And to me, it's not so much because like you said, I don't want a situation where you have to be rich to send your kid to college. Although I would notice that scandal, those people weren't scrabbling over each other to get their kids into just any college. They were scrabbling over each other to get into very specific elite universities, like some of the ones you just mentioned, Yale and Harvard, which have so much money in their endowments. They're considering not even charging tuition anymore. It seems charging tuition these days is just nominal for them, which I guess great for them. But to me, it's all about delivery mechanism, right? It's education is a product. Maybe it's Philistine of me to think of it this way, but education is a product, and we're trying to deliver it to people. So do we have the right delivery mechanism? Are there things that the North Dakota University system could do to get more efficient in delivering that product, which also then helps us avoid some of these ups and downs of budget cuts?
Well, once again, you're hitting the big questions. In fact, the state board grappled with these. We had a really good kind of breakout where board members broke up into different tables, and just for your listeners to know, they grappled with some pretty big issues. And one of them is this misalignment of how our state was settled, east to west. And we do have a lot of colleges, in Minnesota and eastern North Dakota. We've got NDSU, UND, Mayville, Valley City, and Wahpeton, all pretty close to the border. Valley City is about an hour away. But meanwhile, the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and at least one of the publications, has identified North Dakota as in the top 4 worst served as far as proximity to education, because of the distances in western North Dakota. They call them education deserts. So in some ways, we have this massive oil boom, which is going to bring thousands of jobs with demands for highly skilled workers. And thank goodness we have some of these small campuses, Williston and Dickinson. So, and Bismarck and Bottineau, Minot. So back to your question, the delivery mechanism, we're grappling with that. The state board's grappling with that. They asked for a study by NDSU on distance agriculture. On-premise versus online. And so what they came up with was a compromise of Dickinson State is going to offering a 4+1 agriculture program. And, Dickinson State is also going to become a polytechnic. I mean, they realize they can't pour concrete and ask for more money to build a community college in Dickinson. So Dickinson has become both, which is a national movement, dual purpose, your facilities. But if you look at the chart of western North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Dickinson is the only school offering agriculture program between Missoula and Dickinson, and Cheyenne and South Dakota State. I mean, there's this huge gap of all these young people and adults in western North Dakota, Montana, northeastern Wyoming, northwestern South Dakota that have no access to agriculture programming. That's a problem, So anyway, we have to have a delivery mechanism of online, on-premise, hybrid, dual mission, and we're working through all those things. But a good question. I wish I had an easy answer.
Last question for you. Obviously, we just came through a budget cycle, and I'm sure your answer to me, if I asked you about it, is that you're wonderful. Everything was wonderful with the budget because that's what the legislators passed, and that's what you're going to be living with for the next 2 years. But let's say going into the next budget cycle, what would you like to see happen to the budget? Do the universities need more money? And if you had more money, what would you do with it?
Well, again, great question. I don't know, maybe you were talking to some of our legislators. The economy is rapidly changing. I'll make a plug for my office and some of my people, but we published an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education about the crisis in rural mountain states that was nationally published, and there's a sad dynamic going on. The very wealthy schools are poaching our best researchers. We've got the data on this. We just lost 2 electrical engineers, a computer scientist in the last 6 weeks to New York and California. We lost our data analytics guy to New York a year and a half ago. We are in a battle for research, and they are eating our seed corn. And one of my biggest disappointments is we didn't get that research funding. We got a bill called 1333, Mike Nathy, which is a huge, important innovation bill with companies. But we are in a battle for our talent, our researchers. I just had lunch with a Bismarck Mandan software executive. He is having to go to schools in Virginia to get the computer science because we can't produce them fast enough. But quite frankly, we just lost computer science professors. So the biggest disappointment is we don't have more money in those high demand digital areas. I do commend NDSU, and Bismarck just got a huge NSA certification on cyber, which now makes us competitive to help the Air Force. So we're in a battle for research, inventors, innovation, and the legislature looked real hard at it, and they passed it in one house, not the second. I think that's going to be important to come back. The state board talked about that. They're fully behind it. The other thing long term is I think we need to at least begin to talk by 2030 about a stabilization of the higher ed budget, much like K-12 has, that we can stabilize these swings of a commodity-based economy until such time as we diversify our economy, that we don't have our best professors basically have to choose between getting poached by, New York, California, Denver, because no pay raises for 4 years, and that's what we went through. 4 years, no pay raises. And that's pretty tough. And we lost 700 people.
Yeah.
So it was,
there's a lot of people in the private sector who went through that too.
Cuts, since the Great Depression we went through. So anyway, that was a couple thoughts.
Yeah. Well, Mark, I appreciate your time. Certainly, anytime you want to come on, I like having you on. I like talking about this stuff. So certainly appreciate it.
All right. Thank you for having us. All the best.
That's it for today's Plain Talk Podcast. Thanks always for listening. If you would rate or review this podcast on whatever platform you're listening to it on, if it allows ratings and reviews, I would appreciate your honest feedback. And speaking of feedback, you can always email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com, if you have any trouble listening to the show, if you want to respond to some of the things I'm talking about, or submit questions for our weekly guest, Senator Kevin Cramer or Congressman Kelly Armstrong, you could certainly do that. Also, the podcast's available on just about every platform out there. I'm still finding, I'm downloading new podcasting apps all the time and making sure that the podcast is available there. If you find one where I'm not yet available, if you could email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com, I would be happy to try to get the podcast submitted. Also, if you want to follow my columns, the blog posts, this podcast, if you follow me on social media, that's a real good way to do it. Just search for Rob Port on Facebook or Twitter, or search for Say Anything Blog. The blog has accounts as well, and you'll find me. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.